When first visiting Clemson, you wouldn't notice all of the historic sites and the many stories behind them. Fort Hill was the home of John C. Calhoun. It is located right in the middle of campus, and many students walk right past it, but never knowing the true history behind it. I chose to look further at the marker located at Fort Hill because it is right outside my dorm and I can even see it from my window. I've always wondered exactly what it was. Like I said, John C. Calhoun lived in the Fort Hill house with his wife. John C. Calhoun was a statesman in South Carolina from 1825 to 1850 and actively worked to protect slavery in the South. He thought of slavery as a positive good. He also owned many slaves, and these slaves worked on his cotton plantation and also labored at the Fort Hill household. The marker in front of the Fort Hill house reads, "One of the only two National Historic Landmarks located on college campus, Fort Hill was the home of university founders Thomas Green and Anna Maria Calhoun Clemson, and Anna's parents, Mr. and Mrs. John C. Calhoun. It was built in 1803 as a four-room manse for Old Stone Church and passed to Mrs. Clemson through her mother, Florid Calhoun, who inherited the home and 1,341 acres of land from her mother. Before the Civil War, 139 enslaved African Americans worked the plantation, and African Americans continued to be a vital force in Hill operations until Mr. Clemson's death in 1888. The majority of this sign is about the founders and doesn't mention till the very end that there were also slaves. The way in which it's worded makes it sound like it's trying to make the history about this site about the physical building, which is distracting from the stories about the slaves. Even on Clemson's website about Fort Hill, you have to scroll all the way to the bottom to learn more about the slavery part of Fort Hill, which can be hard to find. The way the marker says African Americans continue to be a vital force in Hill operations seems like it's trying to subtly make it seem like a good thing there were slaves. The marker also makes use of kairos. It's interesting that the marker chooses to list Thomas Green and Anna Maria Calhoun Clemson first as the residents who lived at Fort Hill, even though John C. Calhoun lived there first. This could also be a subtle attempt to not have the focus of the site being the home of an active advocate for slavery. The sign doesn't use many pathos till the end when it talks about slaves in a way to try and make you have a less negative perspective on this historical landmark. It's unfortunate also that we don't know any perspectives from the slaves because of no written record. Overall, this particular marker ineffectively displays the true stories about this very historic site. It doesn't include that the man who lived there was a driving force in making sure slavery stayed in the South as long as possible, the stories about what the slaves actually had to go through, or what life was really like. Since this historic site is historical mainly because of slavery, the focus should be put on the slaves who lived at Fort Hill. Focusing on the less uncomfortable things to talk about is a common trend, not just at Clemson historical sites, but everywhere, and it needs to change.